Church apologies. There is an old and well-accepted adage that states, "It takes a village to raise a child." The removal of Aboriginal children from their villages was seen as a necessary step in the achievement of assimilation. However, not only did the Government of Canada take the children from their homes, but it also then proceeded to destroy the cultural and functional integrity of the communities from which the children came and to which they would return. Christian teachings were a fundamental aspect of residential schools. Aboriginal children were taught to reject the spiritual ways of their parents and ancestors in favor of the religions that predominated among settler societies. As their traditional ways of worshiping the Creator were disparaged and rejected, so too were the children devalued. They were not respected as human beings who were equally loved by the Creator just as they were, as First Nations, Inuit, or Métis peoples. Rather, their Christian teachers saw them as inferior humans in need of being raised up through Christianity, and tried to mold them into models of Christianity according to the racist ideals that prevailed at the time. The impact of such treatment was amplified by federal laws and policies that banned traditional Indigenous spiritual practices in the children's home communities for much of the residential school era. Spiritual violence occurs when a person is not permitted to follow her or his preferred spiritual or religious tradition. A different spiritual or religious path or practice is forced on a person. A person's spiritual or religious tradition, beliefs, or practices are demeaned or belittled, or a person is made to feel shame for practicing his or her traditional or family beliefs. There is plenty of evidence to support our conclusion that spiritual violence was common in residential schools. The effects of this spiritual violence have been profound and did not end with the schools. At the Alberta National event, survivor Theodore Ted Fontaine could have spoken for many survivors when he said, "I went through sexual abuse. I went through physical abuse, mental, spiritual. And I'll tell you, the one thing that we suffered from the most is the mental and spiritual abuse that we carried for the rest of our lives." At the Saskatchewan National event, survivor and elder Noel Starblanket, National Chief of the National Indian Brotherhood, later the Assembly of First Nations, talked about the intergenerational spiritual impacts of the residential schools. He said, "My great-grandfather was the first one to be abused by these churches and by these governments, and they forced his children into an Indian residential school and began that legacy. They called him a pagan, a heathen, and that was in the late 1800s. So I've been living with that in my family since then." That Christians in Canada, in the name of their religion, inflicted serious harms on Aboriginal children, their families, and communities was in fundamental contradiction to what they purported to be their core beliefs. For the churches to avoid repeating their failures of the past, understanding how and why they perverted Christian doctrine to justify their actions is a critical lesson to be learned from the residential school experience. Between 1986 and 1998, all 4 settlement agreement churches offered apologies or statements of regret in one form or another for their attempts to destroy Indigenous cultures, languages, spirituality, and ways of life, and more specifically for their involvement in residential schools. The United, Anglican, and Presbyterian churches followed similar pathways. Individuals or communities at the national level of each church became aware that there might be a need to apologize. A decision-making process was established at the highest levels of the church, and the apology was subsequently issued through the moderator or primate who spoke for the whole church. Unlike the 3 Protestant denominations, the Roman Catholic Church in Canada does not have a single spokesperson with authority to represent all of its many dioceses and distinct religious orders. The issuing of apologies or statements of regret was left up to each of them individually. The result has been a patchwork of apologies or statements of regret that few survivors or church members may even know exist. Roman Catholics in Canada and across the globe look to the Pope as their spiritual and moral leader. Therefore, it has been disappointing to survivors and others that the Pope has not yet made a clear and emphatic public apology in Canada for the abuses perpetuated in Catholic-run residential schools throughout the country. On April 29, 2009, National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, Phil Fontaine, 4 other Aboriginal leaders, and 5 leaders from the Roman Catholic community in Canada traveled to Rome for a private audience with Pope Benedict XVI. No recording of the private meeting was permitted, but the Vatican issued a communiqué describing what the Pope said. Quote, "Given the sufferings that some Indigenous children experienced in the Canadian residential school system, the Holy Father expressed his sorrow at the anguish caused by the deplorable conduct of some members of the Church, and he offered his sympathy and prayerful solidarity. His Holiness emphasized that acts of abuse cannot be tolerated in society. He prayed that all those affected would experience healing, and he encouraged First Nations people to continue to move forward with renewed hope." End of quote. The media reported that National Chief Fontaine and other Aboriginal leaders who had met with the Pope said that the statement was significant for all survivors. Fontaine told CBC News that although it was not an official apology, he hoped that the Pope's statement of regret would bring closure to the issue for residential school survivors. Quote, "The fact that the word apology was not used does not diminish this moment in any way." End of quote, he said. "This experience gives me great comfort." The Pope's statement of regret was significant to those who were present and was reported widely in the media, but it is unclear what, if any, impact it had on survivors and their families and communities who were not able to hear the Pope's words themselves. Many survivors raised the lack of a clear Catholic apology from the Vatican as evidence that the Catholic Church still has not come to terms with its own wrongdoing in residential schools and has permitted many Catholic nuns and priests to maintain that the allegations against their colleagues are false. The statement of regret that children were harmed in the schools is a far cry from a full and proper apology that takes responsibility for the harms that occurred. The Commission notes that in 2010, Pope Benedict XVI responded to the issue of the abuse of children in Ireland differently and more clearly when he issued a pastoral letter, a public statement that was distributed through the churches to all Catholics in Ireland. He acknowledged that the Church had failed to address the issue of child abuse in Catholic institutions. He said, quote, "Only by examining carefully the many elements that gave rise to the present crisis can a clear-sighted diagnosis of its causes be undertaken and effective remedies be found. Certainly, among the contributing factors, we can include inadequate procedures for determining the suitability of candidates for the priesthood and the religious life, insufficient human, moral, intellectual, and spiritual formation in seminaries and novitiates, a tendency in society to favor the clergy and other authority figures, and a misplaced concern for the reputation of the Church and the avoidance of scandal, resulting in failure to apply existing canonical penalties and to safeguard the dignity of every person. Urgent action is required to address these factors which have had such tragic consequences in the lives of victims and their families." End of quote. He directly addressed those who were abused as children by church clergy. Quote, "You have suffered grievously, and I am truly sorry. I know that nothing can undo the wrong you have endured. Your trust has been betrayed, and your dignity has been violated. Many of you found that when you were courageous enough to speak of what happened to you, no one would listen. Those of you who were abused in residential institutions must have felt that there was no escape for your sufferings. It is understandable that you find it hard to forgive or be reconciled with the church. In her name, I openly express the shame and remorse that we all feel. At the same time, I ask you not to lose hope. Speaking to you as a pastor concerned for the good of all God's children, I humbly ask you to consider what I have said, and that you will be able to find reconciliation, deep inner healing, and peace. End of quote. In Canada, for more than a century, thousands of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children were subjected to spiritual, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse in Catholic-run residential schools. Other than a small private audience with Pope Benedict XVI in 2009, the Vatican has remained silent on the Roman Catholic Church's involvement in the Canadian residential school system. During the Commission's hearings, many survivors told us that they knew that the Pope had apologized to survivors of Catholic-run schools in Ireland. They wondered why no similar apology had been extended to them. They said, "I did not hear the Pope say to me, 'I'm sorry.' Those words are very important to me, but he didn't say that to First Nations people." Call to Action 58. We call upon the Pope to issue an apology to survivors, their families, and communities for the Roman Catholic Church's role in the spiritual, cultural, emotional, physical, and sexual abuse of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children in Catholic-run residential schools. We call for that apology to be similar to the 2010 apology issued to Irish victims of abuse and to occur within 1 year of the issuing of this report and to be delivered by the Pope in Canada.